And share screen. Okay, am I visible? Okay, I guess I'm visible. So the first talk is by Mark Alvis and Rickard Dockham. It is entitled Etymological Research on Words for the Household in Greater Mainland Southeast Asia. And there we go. So in previous publications and talks I've given, I've looked at mainland Southeast Asian words for metals, metal implements, domesticated birds, pottery and ceramics, other categories as well. And recently I gave a talk on Proto-Austroasiatic terms for household structures, but it was Proto-Austroasiatic, and I found a lot that were in mainland Southeast Asia. And I looked through the usual data sources, all of these digital databases that we have to sift nowadays, and it's pretty efficient, pretty effective. Of course, it's not everything, but it's certainly better than what we had even 20 years ago. But there's not a Kra-Dai database, and this is where Ricker comes in. He had these large quantities of Kra-Dai lexicons in a spreadsheet. These are from many different fieldwork sources, lots of data, as well as an extensive spreadsheet of Hmong-Mien languages lects from Chun 2012. And so we combined our efforts, and Ricker will talk a little bit about how we did that.
Right. So in our study, we have a few different questions we're looking at. We're studying terms for residential structures, things related to the house and the household. And so we don't know what are the word forms we actually see across family boundaries within Greater Mainland Southeast Asia. We care about what languages and language families they're found in, but then also their geographic distribution. So the question is, what are the sources? What can we figure out about what languages or families they come from? And then also, what can the sort of archaeological situation clarify about linguistics, but also vice versa, what can our linguistic knowledge clarify about the archaeology and the spread of material culture? And so then also, what are the implications of all that for contact and sound change and many other things? So we picked out 12 sense clusters. You'll see that these are more or less similar things. There are a couple of reasons why we cluster these things together. Partly that's because of things like actual variation between language semantics, of course. But we also see things like variation between field workers, possibly because of differences in field worker knowledge of things. Does a linguist know the difference between a joist and a beam, and does that matter in the language? So there's some world knowledge considerations to take into account, but there's also just this semantic variation. So for example, we have wall, right? Wall in some word lists may be glossed that way, but wall could be the woven interior wall of a house in some languages, or it could be the wooden external wall of a house in other languages, or it could be the brick or wood or something else, sort of wall surrounding the area of a property. All these things could be lexified differently. So by clustering things together, we're trying to do the best we can to sort of get to have the best chance at figuring out where these things come across from the region. Okay, so of course we can tie a lot of these sources back to different edema, right, from different proto-languages and different branches within those families. But really what we're looking at for our study here is these cross-phyla, inter-phyla loanwords. And so some well-known examples of those include things like Chinese loans into various groups throughout Southeast Asia, and for also the Austroasiatic Southwestern Tai connection in both directions over different periods of time. It's also an important guide from the historical context, so we can divide this up into different eras based on material culture. So we can talk about the Neolithic to early Metal Age. So during this early period, we would expect to see terms for wooden thatched-roofed homes, which we expect to find across all of these language stocks. We can also look at the Iron Age. So this is a period where we would expect to see the spread of tile-roofed homes and brick structures. And this could indicate the presence of Indic and Sinitic influence, both culturally and more specifically linguistically. And then finally, the second millennium into the modern era. So really after large degrees of migration into Greater Mainland Southeast Asia from China, and the spread of those technologies and terminology, as well as retention of traditional forms. So for our study, we've divided loanwords up into some broad periods based on similar trends. We can first look at the before the Common Era. So this would coincide with Old Chinese, and doesn't look like any of the data, of course, in our study goes back that far, but we can certainly identify it as a potential period for comparison. We have the first millennium of the Common Era. So this would predate the Southwestern Tai expansion into modern geographic Thailand. We see a lot of, during this period, we see a lot of direct loaning from Chinese into other languages, Kra-Dai, Vietnamese, Hmong-Mien, but also Indic into Austroasiatic. And so we can sometimes see doublets, right? So Vietnamese BUANG for room would have come from late Old Chinese, early Middle Chinese era. And then if we compare that with the second millennium, so after the Southwestern Tai expansion, then we can see the other part of that doublet, so Vietnamese phang, the same meaning, room coming from late Middle Chinese. And so we can periodize relatedly. And during this most recent period, we can start to see, we still see direct Chinese contact influence, but also indirect, as languages prior to the diaspora spread terms that they would have borrowed from Chinese into their neighboring languages. We also see like the Austroasiatic Southwestern Tai connection that I already mentioned earlier. And then as politics solidify and state-level languages arise and become more powerful, we start to see state-level languages as a major source of influence on minority languages. And Mark, you're going to jump in.
Okay, so I'll give a few of the examples of those semantic clusters. And the first one is to start with is house, and it has a very low borrowability rate cross-linguistically worldwide. In the World Loanword Database, it has a rate of borrowability rate of 0.11, and you don't know what that means yet, of course, but that is comparable to other basic vocabulary, body parts, natural phenomena, and such. And so when we look at the word for house, these are mostly retained and kept in the from the proto-language stages, such as Austroasiatic nya, which is not spread into Dai. The Kra-Dai Ran has not spread into Austroasiatic. The Austronesian form, such as rumah, as in Malay rumah, is not spread into other languages. So this house, meaning where one resides, that's not the word that spreads. Instead, what we have is something like rong, and I use all caps because we cannot reconstruct them, so these are just approximate forms. Rong is for a communal house or hall. Okay, that's not a personal residence. Lang is a classifier for a house. Lao is a multi-storied building. Okay, so this is the way I'll be covering these. So this is this Rong form is found in at least 18 languages, lects of Austroasiatic, in 7 branches all throughout mainland Southeast Asia. It is found in a few Southwest Tai languages, and it is in Malay and Chamic. The Lang form is found in Southwestern Tai, also in mainland Southeast Asia, and several minority Austroasiatic languages only. So these are all contained, interestingly, in mainland Southeast Asia, not extending into China. The one that is in China is one that's found in Chinese. It dates back to first millennium BC texts, widespread in Kra-Dai. It is found in the data that we can find only in Vietnamese and Khmer, the 2 majority languages, and I guess you could call them the city languages, right? Kind of makes sense. As for the sources for Rong, there's no, I could not find any source of this word. It may be an Austronesian practice. That is a question for ethnohistorians to deal with. For the Lang form, it is probably the Lang of Tai. Lang itself is back, which is very widespread, of course, in Dayak, but this specific innovation, meaning classifier for house, that is our assumption here, that it is a grammaticalized form of back, only in Southwest Tai and mainland Southeast Asia. Lo, of course, that's Chinese, most likely, and you'll see more examples of the Chinese forms. So for the chronology of Rong, it's simply unknown. There's not really a clear source. For Lang, it is has to have spread into, well, it appears to have innovated in the second millennium. That's most likely the case after this Southwestern Tai dispersal. For Lao, there is a borrowing in Vietnamese that appears to be from the first millennium based on its tone, but it is most likely a word that has been borrowed in multiple languages at different times. But details are hard to come by because we'd have to look at all of those many languages to see if there's any more information. Okay, so let's look at some word forms for brick and tile. A very high borrowability rate, 0.66 versus the 0.11 of house, okay? And there's tile is not in the world loanword database, just brick. There is a widespread it form seen throughout Austroasiatic, and it is even in Old Khmer texts back to the 600s. In Dayak, it is found mainly in mainland Southeast Asia. It has been considered a likely Indic word, a loan word. So based on the Old Khmer texts, it has to date to the mid-first millennium. But then when after the Dai expansion spreads into some Dai languages, Southwest Dai. For a JUAN form, most likely from Chinese, brick, this one is found very widespread in Kra-Dai, Hmong-Mien, and Tibeto-Burman, but these are mainly in southern China or very close to China. I don't know what to say about how widespread it is in Tibeto-Burman, whether someone would call it a Sino-Tibetan, Proto-Sino-Tibetan thing. I don't know. That's not what I could say. To me, based on what the information we have, it cannot say that anything about the chronology really, but it is pretty much contained within China. It did not spread into mainland Southeast Asia, okay? But we're looking at Greater Mainland Southeast Asia, so it does include southern China, but it is not in mainland Southeast Asia proper. Ngwa for tile is different. There is some chronological information. Vietnamese has this loan word ngoi with a ya off glide, which is comparable to the old Chinese form. Almost all of the others do not have this ya off glide and instead have something like ngwa or wa. And so this would be the oldest form seen in Vietnamese and apparently borrowed into a couple of Kra-Dai languages in Vietnam. But elsewhere throughout southern China and mainland Southeast Asia, broadly, it appears to be later stages of borrowing, so multiple times of borrowing in different languages. Finally, in mainland Southeast Asia, only is a kind of a Kra-Buang form, not too widespread, but it is in a handful of Austroasiatic languages in Southwestern Tai. At this point, we're considering it perhaps a Tai source. The Kra pre-syllable marks it, maybe because of that. It's a little hard to decide what to do with those various Tai words which have the Kra pre-syllables, but it's possible that Kra is the Tai is the likely source, and if so, it spread in mainland Southeast Asia in the second millennium. Let's look at some word forms for room, also a reasonably high borrowability rate. There is a home form, and this is likely Kra-Dai form. It is reconstructed in Proto-Dai, widespread in Kra-Dai, Dayak, and Gamsui. It is borrowed in several Austroasiatic languages in mainland Southeast Asia, most likely second millennium spread of from Southwest Tai into Austroasiatic languages. There is a Khan form. The Khan form is interesting as it is seen in some major languages, Mon, and literate languages, Mon, Burmese, Tibetan, and it has been noted as a possible or likely Indic source. It was a little difficult to find what that source was. We found these possible candidates, but I've not seen it was noted in the Lao dictionary, but as a Sanskrit source, but they didn't provide the actual source. There is an interesting comparison in Chinese. This word here is Middle Chinese Khan, but it's not aspirated, and it originally means space, and it develops that sense of room. Seems more likely that it's Sanskrit, but or some kind of Indic form. Maybe unclear of the timing. Then, as Ricker mentioned, there's this doublet in Vietnamese, there's the BUANG form, the Pham form, with the B onset. This is earlier, closer to either early Middle Chinese or possibly Old Chinese. It's not impossible. But certainly that puts it in the first millennium going into northern Vietnam, and then it spread into some other languages in Vietnam. But the Pham form, the Phang for Chinese with the F onset is something that is definitely for second millennium spreading into some languages. So lastly, let's look at some regional words for window and door. For some reason, window has a notably higher borrowability rate than door. I guess that means something special about windows, and doors are pretty much you've got to have one. These let's see here. There's this bong form for window, which is found in 46 lects of Austroasiatic, 7 branches, including Austroasiatic outside of mainland Southeast Asia proper. I think it was Nicobarese, I can't remember. But that means it's a very good candidate for a Proto-Austroasiatic, a true Proto-Austroasiatic form, etymon, and if so, then it would have spread into Southwest Tai in the second millennium, into those various Southwest Tai languages. Does not spread into southern China. This Chong form for window, most likely a Chinese form found throughout Kra-Dai, quite a few branches there, mostly in China. Hmong-Mien. This is really contained in China, not in mainland Southeast Asia. So we can see a good example of this geographic boundary. Whether it's borrowed whether it was borrowed from a modern Chinese or Southern Chinese variety, it's hard to say, and we would need more information. Oops. And finally, 2 Kra-Dai or Dai forms here. This Dang form, which is a proto-Dai reconstruction here, appears to have spread into Austroasiatic. Again, this is contained in mainland Southeast Asia, not in southern China. But this Du form, very widespread in Kra-Dai. Certainly it was brought into mainland Southeast Asia, but it does not appear to have been borrowed widely in mainland Southeast Asia. So let's consider some observations based on these samples. The lexical data matches pretty well this spread of these multi-storied buildings with bricks and tile roofs, kind of like this picture over here, which is from a miniature excavated from a tomb in northern Vietnam from the Han Dynasty. So this was what was being brought in contrast with the prior wooden structures, the traditional, if you want to call them that, with thatched roofs and living areas focused on one level. What we saw was somewhat of a distinction between mainland Southeast Asia and southern China. In some cases, there's overlap, but in some cases, there are either innovations that happen in mainland Southeast Asia or some other special circumstance. The sources, of course, include many Chinese forms that went directly into Kra-Dai and Vietnamese and secondarily into other languages, that Southwest Tai and Austroasiatic bidirectional exchange, and various loans into Hmong-Mien, Chamic, and some Tibeto-Burman languages as well. The chronology, there are only some insights from the phonology. There are some, the Chinese doublets in Vietnamese and others. There is some information from the textual data, such as old Khmer attestations. And of course, we rely on historical information about the Han expansion and the hypothesized timing of the Southwest Tai dispersal, which can, I suppose, be reasonably assumed, but not necessarily agreed upon by everyone. Remaining issues to consider, we need more phonological details, such as what was going on in the Kra-Dai languages in southern China. Can we get any more chronology out of that? And of course, a little bit more archaeohistorical information about the spread of the timing of that kind of architecture could give information about the spread of those word forms. And so that's what we have. And we hope that maybe someone has some comments or questions. Thank you very much. Oh, I think I don't know how we're supposed to do this. I think we're supposed to use the chat box. Is that how this works?